Good morning, everyone. It is very good to see you again for this next session of Priest and Rabbi Walk into a Classroom. Aaron has been praying out of the tradition of his own tradition of Reform Judaism. This morning, I will offer a prayer that was used before all the Bible study classes the last 6 years or so at Calvary. It's called the Collect. Collect is a type of prayer in our tradition that collects the thoughts of the day and brings them together. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who has caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life. Amen. Amen. Please, people, come on in. A couple of announcements before we get started. If you want to hear a great sermon from a great preacher, come to Calvary Church next week where Rabbi Aaron Bisno will be preaching at 8, 9, and 11. We get our money's worth with Aaron, I was saying, particularly seeing that he's a volunteer here. And also beginning this Wednesday at 12:30, we resumed a 12 o'clock Wednesday service of Holy Communion or Eucharist. It's in the Lady Chapel. And then right after that at 12:30, Aaron is teaching a class called Back to the Sources. It's the first one begins. And Back to the Sources, I'll let you hear it from the source.
Will be a 5-6 session overview of sacred scripture, Jewish literature. We'll start with the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, break it down and work from there through Talmud and Midrash and other rabbinic literature. We'll go at the pace that makes most sense. No expectation of any prior experience or familiarity with Hebrew or Judaism is expected. So it should be a really interesting opportunity to look from a high level at the sacred sources that are the foundation of our traditions.
Where does it take place?
Right here at Calvary in room, when you get
We'll
here.
tell you where to go when you come in.
Come to the
12:30.
building. They'll tell me where to be, and I'll be there.
Yesterday, this context for discussion today. Yesterday, Aaron and I spent 2 hours meeting with a group of college students and some just right out of college, about 20 of them, and they're part of an organization called Passages. And Passages is a Christian organization that helps young Christians learn about their Jewish roots. There's some strange groups like that. This is a very solid organization that helps them rediscover, to go back to the sources, just like Aaron is doing, to learn about where we come from, what's our identity as Christians, how has it emerged from Judaism. And the capstone project they do is to take a trip to Israel together and learn about this. And the group was very diverse in terms of a lot of the markers we think of these days. Aaron and I spent 2 full hours with them. And they had a real live priest and a real live rabbi to talk to. And what I learned, many of them I would say were evangelical Christians, I think is fair. They asked us, there was like a 15, 20-minute presentation, and the next hour and 40 minutes were simply questions we were responding to. And I noted several things remarkably similar to this class that we're engaged in. What did you experience, Aaron?
My sense was they were fascinated by how people who ostensibly see the world so very differently could possibly get along, and how we're able to talk about anything we have in common given the glaring differences that they imagine divide us.
Yeah, well, we talked about the very first class. So I believe Jesus is the Messiah, Aaron does not. Well, that's a really big difference. That's a fair statement. And one young woman kept asking, well, how do you reconcile all the differences you have? And she asked it early in the discussion, and then about 30 minutes later, but you must disagree on lots of things. How can you work together? And it was fascinating, that was a big concern to her and clearly several other people. And my response is, look, I assume that everybody I talk to, that I will not agree with them 100%. The only exception is my wife, and if any husband is here, your wife is right 100% of the time. End of story. But everybody else, we might disagree on something. And you have to learn to like, and in fact, Jesus says to love people, not even nice, kindred, family types, but even your enemy, that we can begin to see that as another person, another child of God. And Aaron, something that's so fundamental to me, you talked about, why do we do what we do at Calvary? And that was they were trying to get their minds around, why do you have like an Ethiopian church here? And why is there a rabbi in residence? And why do you do this skating thing? And why are you about to go make 100,000 meals with people? The focus on, you were saying.
The focus on, I've said it before, not what we believe, but what our beliefs compel us to do, right? That we may start the journey from different places or may be motivated on our journey for different reasons, but there's so much that we share in common about what we believe the world ought to look like, or what our responsibilities are given the limited time that we have to make our contribution to the world. And that I assume that I won't agree with anyone in 100% of the ways, and yet when we focus on what we share in common, or where we have common ground or communion and can just create community, then in those ways we can actually accomplish things. And that's how it used to be, even in my lifetime, that we would find what we share in common and that's what we would focus on, as opposed to beginning from a position that says, if I know you should have this belief, which differs from mine, then I can ascribe to you all these other beliefs and motivations, and therefore we needn't even dialogue, which is absolutely the antithesis of every religious tradition that I know that's healthy and vibrant and that is worth being part of.
Yeah. Part of the context for all this, too, is what's about to happen on Tuesday. The vote. Tuesday. I honestly, and I've done a lot of research, I'm not sure what all the candidates in my area stand for, but I know absolutely what they are against. That anti-democratic, horrible, racist, sexist, homophobe, that awful socialist, connected to reality, blah, blah, that other person is bad. That's the root of it. So what do you believe and stand for? That person's terrible. That's what it sounds like. Now, that's obviously over-characterizing, a caricature even, but I've been asked the same thing, and I know Aaron has too many times, so not what do we disagree about is not the area of focus. But what do we, I'll say for Calvary, what do we as a congregation stand for, believe, inhabit, or as he would put it, not what do we believe, what do we do? How do we live out our faith? And so some of the ways we talked about these positive, creative things, this is who we are, and you know what we are by what we do. Proof is in the pudding, is actually the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, what it tastes like. And that's what we're trying to do here with you. Brief poll again, because it changes every time. How many of you here identify as Jews, Jewish people? How many identify, big hands about to come up, Episcopalians? What other religious groups are here? Anybody? Presbyterian, great. Catholic, excellent. And so rather than focus on the big differences among those groups, to focus on what we have in common, and again, what our call is within our individual tradition. So again, all that's context, and it was really fun to talk to young people that clearly had their eyes open, that didn't realize there could be a different way to be a person of faith, a different type of church. Charlotte, would you come up and read? This is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18.
Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, But later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?"
So I wanted to give a little bit of context or pull back the lens a bit as we approach this text, and to invite you to consider a few things, and then I want to read you just a couple of passages from the book that actually inspired the idea for this class. It's called Short Stories by Jesus by Amy Jill Levine, who's a distinguished professor at Vanderbilt. And the idea is how to explore the parables of Jesus with avoiding an anti-Jewish bias or appreciating that Jewish overtones inform the parables. We can read these biblical texts in a number of ways. Sometimes we have too much information. We may know too much, so we no longer view it with what Yo-Yo Ma refers to as children's eyes, as if we're looking at something for the very first time. So we know something about Luke or the Gospels themselves, or where in the Gospel that this finds itself. So there's a parable just ahead of it, or just behind it, or even the way in which it's described, or we've long ascribed to this particular parable or any other particular text a given name or title that isn't actually perhaps in the text, but has been used to define the text, and as a result it colors the way in which we think about what we've just heard. So for instance, while there's some titles at the top of the page that's available to read from, how do you know of this parable? Those of you who have heard this parable before or are familiar with it, how would you make reference to it? What's the title by which you know this parable?
Unjust judge.
The unjust judge. Does anyone know another title for this? The persistent widow. That's familiar to you. It's not the first time you've seen it, right? The persistent widow, the unjust judge. Each of those necessarily colors how we begin to approach the text, right? Because it's a certain bias, the same way a headline in the newspaper. It says something about what's contained within the article, but it may or may not actually describe the sense that you're going to get from it, or the other telling of it. If two people were to write the same story, and then along comes a headline writer to put the appellation on it. I tell this story, I just had occasion to tell it just this past week to my older son. He's 17, he's a senior at Alderdice. He's taking a class online from CCAC, a writing class. And so we're working on an essay, and between the prompt for the essay and the title he'd given it, and then what's actually contained in the 5 or 6 paragraphs that he's put together, there were some differences. And I shared with him the following story, and that is that in college I received only 1 grade on a paper that I recall. And it was a paper on which I was assigned a C, but the paper, or the essence of the paper was given a B+, but the grade that was recorded was a C. And the reason the professor explained was that the paper's quality was a B+, but you'd mistitled it. And so I came and I thought I was going to be reading a paper about this, and your essay didn't support what you told me it was about. And therefore you got a C on the paper because you didn't write about what you said you were going to write about. And it was the most important lesson I learned in college, the only grade of paper I recall, and I share it with you to invite you to consider that the title itself may give us information that we bring to the text that maybe it doesn't deserve, or that we deserve better than someone else's decision of what to title the parable. I want to share with you a little bit of what Amy Jill Levine says about parables as we begin to approach what meaning we can glean from the text. Parables are designed to shake up one's worldview, to question the conventional. If a manager can be dishonest, a tax collector righteous, a landowner generous enough to provide a living wage to everyone in the marketplace, and a judge be neither God-fearing nor respectful toward people, surely a widow can be vengeful. What she sees as justice for something that we or her legal adversary might see as a perversion of justice. For the parable to do its work, for it to challenge all our views rather than to reinforce normative gender and class constructs, for example, another look at the widow is necessary. And that could be said of every one of the characters in every one of the parables. Perhaps that very difficulty in making an easy transition from the text to what the text means for us should be a starting point for us in attempting to understand a parable. For if the parable cannot be domesticated, by which we mean made simple and easily grasped, right, rather than being wild and it's unclear what it is about, if the parable cannot be domesticated, if it cannot be turned into something that neatly fits our preconceived notions of religion or morality, if it continues to discombobulate us, then we may just be on the right track. So I share that with you so that we shouldn't misunderstand that our goal today is consensus, or that we all come to the right, correct understanding of what this parable is about, but rather to give you permission and license to come to a familiar text, even a sacred text, with, again, what Yo-Yo Ma refers to as children's eyes. And maybe we'll have beginner's luck to trip upon a kind of meaning that didn't immediately suggest itself.
What is, in Jewish tradition, what is, when you say a widow, what does that evoke? What are we supposed to understand immediately about this widow?
Well, what connotations do we think of when we think of a widow, or the widow, or the stranger, the widow, the orphan?
She doesn't have much money.
Someone who's poor. We assume that about a widow. But there are very wealthy widows. We certainly know that's an archetype also. But it's not the one that's evoked from a religious text, right? Because to a widow we ascribe what qualities? She's dependent upon someone, right? Which is also to suggest that she has no means of sustaining herself, right? That's the archetype. What else? What other qualities do we ascribe to a widow? I'm sorry. She's disenfranchised. She's not otherwise represented. She doesn't have an advocate on her behalf. Good.
Grieving.
She's grieving, which is to say, what about someone who's grieving? She's weak. Sympathetic. Maybe we owe her something, our pity, our time. She needs something. Yes? I don't want to over-determine it. Yes? What? There was a hand here. Please. She can't sustain herself. So she's vulnerable. She's weak. She's in need. Right? There's also, yeah, please.
Is she a recent widow? Do we know anything about that?
We know nothing about that.
Is she adjusting to a new way of life? Is what I mean.
Is she newly widowed? Is she adjusting to a new way of life? Is she always going to be a widow? If she remarries, is she still a widow? Right? We don't know anything about her. We only know she's a widow.
Little family.
She has little family.
Yeah, because in that time, wouldn't her late husband's family support her?
Perhaps. We don't know how old she is. Maybe she has adult children.
Yeah.
We don't know anything about her other than that she's a widow, which is intended to evoke from us some kind of connection, or certainly we step in, or we want to. It's our propensity to fill in the gaps and to ascribe to her some qualities, and probably it's somewhat overdetermined because the widow, the stranger, the orphan, it's the archetype of someone who needs the help or to whom we should not forget or overlook. Yes?
Well, also it says, grant me justice against my opponent. So somebody has a grievance against her for something, right, that we don't know about?
Well, she certainly has a grievance. We don't know anything about the other party.
Right.
There's a third party, right? There's another party to this story somewhere who's going to actually be affected by what happens in the parable, but is otherwise unnamed, right? And what do we know about the judge? Heartless, because... Okay. Okay. What else can we say about the judge? I'm sorry? Not religious. Doesn't believe in God, doesn't fear God. What does the fear of God mean? The beginning of wisdom. So to not fear God is to not be wise, and we want wisdom in our judges. That's one of the characteristics we hope they possess, right? And this judge seems to lack that. What kind of judge is that? What else can we say about the judge? Or do we bring to the idea of who this individual is in the same way as we think we know something about a widow, certainly a widow from that time period when we would imagine certain things about her family or about the society. What do we know about a judge in such a world, or in our world today? Yes?
No respect for people.
Right? It says he has no respect for people, which means what?
How can he have justice if he doesn't respect people?
Very good.
He cares only about himself.
Seems to only care about himself.
He's afraid she'll slap him in the face.
He's afraid that...
He's afraid.
He's afraid?
I think that was a footnote about being slapped in the face.
All right, so you're bringing outside information, right? That's some insight into that something he fears, and there are different ways of doing translations. We can talk about that. But he doesn't seem to be a judge that is due much respect. All due respect, Your Honor?
Would you want this guy as your judge? No.
Right? Yes?
But he does finally do the right thing.
Does he? Go ahead.
Or questionable motives maybe, but he doesn't. He could have just said, go away. He could have just continued telling her to go away.
Yes, he could have, and maybe she deserved to be told to go away. I mean, we're assuming that your comment is comfortable for us, but I want to discomfort us a bit, right? I want to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So how do we know she was bringing a claim that deserved to be adjudicated the way he ruled? I mean, it doesn't seem like she actually brought her case. He just threw in the towel and gave her what she wanted. I'm only challenging the preconceptions we bring to the story. We want a judge to do the right thing. We know what it feels like to be the penitent or to be the one who feels that we're powerless and we're going up against a more powerful adversary. And finally, we wear them down. Finally, the government official at the other side of the desk gives in to our entreaties that, just sign the document, stamp it already, and let me go on with my life. We know something about that experience, that kind of frustration, so we like the idea that a judge rules in our favor. But it doesn't necessarily mean that justice was done. The parable is rather terse.
Thank you. I preached on this relatively recently. Some of you may remember. In some, from what I heard in the traditional interpretation, when we say widow, helpless in some way, needs our help, might be a better way to put it. And the judge is supposed to dispense justice, do the right thing for the right reasons. So I think most people have some identity of that in mind, and then we get to the story. And Jesus very often switches things around on purpose. Why would you do that? Why would you switch the expectations? You see one thing and expect to come in and then, wow, that's something really different. Why would he do this as a teaching device? You remember it better. It creates a dynamic that didn't exist before. Like, for example, the rector's going to teach a class, the rabbi will teach a class, but the rabbi and the priest will teach a class together, is suddenly a new thing. And Jesus is using a very similar technique. This is a new thing because a judge doesn't act like a judge is supposed to, and the widow doesn't act like a widow is supposed to. So in that, without redoing that whole sermon, what is also, this is a little bit of a commentary of context. In the time that this was written, Gospel of Luke, most of the Gospels, by the way, we're talking about the year 65 Common Era to 90 or 100, and so roughly a couple generations after Jesus. And the church, as we know it, was almost exclusively at that point Jewish. They were Jews who also followed the teachings of Jesus. And there was a lot of persecution going on for being a follower of Jesus, what was sometimes called the way or Christian and so on. And if you're catching a lot of flack for being a Jew or being a follower of Jesus, it's nice to be reminded that you are not alone in this, and that also don't give up. So some would say this is a story from Jesus that is used by the gospel writer Luke to say, don't give up when things are going against you. Never lose heart. And then inserts the story. So that, remember, every good story, every good parable is polyvalent, multivalent. It has multiple meanings at multiple levels. So Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. Don't give up. In a certain city, where is that? It means anywhere. There was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. As we said, fear of God, respect is, when we say fear, it really means respect, reverence, awe for. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. In that anywhere city, there was a widow who kept coming to that judge saying, she doesn't say, please, would you hear me, judge? You're so wise and handsome and wonderful. Please hear my case and grant me justice. She says, give me justice against my opponent. It's very sharp, it sounds like. And that's, you can imagine a lot of scenarios. I have no money and I have to eat. And if you're desperate enough, particularly for your kids, what would you do as a parent, as a grandparent? They had no food. What would you do? Anything. That's exactly right. Anything. So her anything is, what do I have to lose? I have to get justice. And justice in this sense is not a large biblical, this is a judgment in my favor. That's in this sense, that's what she's talking about. For a while the judge refused, but later he said to himself, though I have no fear of God or respect to people, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. What Clint was referring to, I also said in the sermon, most of the time this is a wonderful English translation, but the Greek here really puts the point home. And this is not a widow saying, please judge, hear my petition. The Greek says, she's going to wear me out and give me a black eye. And it uses the verb for pummel, like the widow is not the, oh, help, punching him. Give me what I want. Over and over and over. That's not a politeness, that's a demand. I will be heard by you, judge. And so the judge is like, I can't be embarrassed by this nobody widow. I got to do something. And I put her off long enough, and I've, let her get lost in the system and the bureaucracy. But it's embarrassing, isn't it, to have this widow keep coming yelling at me all the time. So I'll give her what she wants so she may not give me a black eye. That again is the Greek. And the Lord said, Jesus, listen to what the unjust judge says, and will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? So in this simple face value interpretation, we are the widow who are called to be persistent, deliberate, intentional in prayer, and God is so much more merciful and just than this horrible one. And if even an unjust human judge will give you justice, God, the most amazing, wonderful creator of the universe, of course, will do more. And that's all true, and that's good. But what did I say at the end of the sermon that Aaron caught on to?
Yep, but I'm going to get there because I thought it was
go ahead.
So good. I want to just point out a couple of things. The first is, as I was looking at this text here, if we peel back the onion a bit and pull off the verses that are not the heart of the parable, we can begin to see certain things here. So for instance, the opening verse, then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart, isn't actually part of the parable, right? So let's take that out and just read from, he said, in a certain city, There was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people, and in that city there was a widow who kept coming to this judge and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." That's the parable. Then it continues, and the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge said." Now that's a different voice, right? Do you appreciate that? As we're reading it, it's sort of an omniscient narrator. The Lord then comments on the parable itself. But if we just look at the verses that are about the parable, you follow what I'm doing here? Sort of excising this, we can begin to take it, just zero in on that. Something's lost in so doing, but something's gained also. There's a rabbinic means of reading text called midrash. Midrash is both the word that describes the activity, it's what's created through the activity, and that name lends itself to the entire literature that was created thereby. And if you remember, in the first week, I spoke about this story about Pardes, or paradise. It was spelled with 4 letters. For our purposes, P-R-D-N-S, Pardes. And each one was a level of understanding. The first was Pashat, it's simply the surface story. There's a garden, and there's a snake, and there's an apple, and there's a man and a woman. In this story, there's a widow, and there's a judge, and that's the story, and they have a conversation, and then the story ends. And there's another level, the remez, which is R, which is the hint that there's something deeper going on, which may just be the fact that the story is included in the canon. It's part of what's being passed down, so that itself suggests that there's more going on than simply a story about a widow and a judge. That happens every day. This is a little bit different. The third level is drash, the D, P-A-R-D. That's where midrash comes in. That's where we begin to read into the story our own interpolation. Or we get to play with the characters, or we get to move around and take the words of the story and do something with them. And in midrash, you may go as deep as a given word or even a given letter. And so when the classic midrashim, that's the plural for midrash, is told about the first opening words of the book of Genesis, which says in the beginning, but the first word is Bereshit in Hebrew. That's written with the letter Bet, is the first letter of the Torah. Bereshit, that's how the Torah opens. That's how the Old Testament begins, with the letter Bet. And the rabbis say the letter Bet's the second letter of the alphabet. Why would the Torah begin with the second letter of the alphabet? Alpha, beta, right? Aleph, bet. Why would the Torah begin with the second letter? And from that they have this wonderful conversation that gives midrash to the story. And you can read into that. What Jonathon did in his sermon was classic and brilliant midrash. I said to him afterwards, I said, that was so good. I'm not sure. It was like the doorknob, you know about doorknob confessions? When you go to the therapist, you spend your 50 minutes talking about whatever you spend your 50 minutes talking about, and on the way out, you put your hand on the door and they go, "Oh, listen, by the way," and then you say what you should have been talking about for the last hour, right? The doorknob confession. So Jonathan gives this wonderful sermon about this parable, and then on the very end he says, hang on, I want to get this right. What if the parable about the unjust judge or the persistent widow, what if this operates at a deeper level? What if, in fact, we are the judge and God is the widow? Think about it. We are the judge and God is the widow. It's not us bothering God to get what we want, but the Lord who pursues us relentlessly, recklessly to get our attention. Knocking and seeking, calling, loving us without fail until we find faith. Now in that, and it's confusing when you begin to think about it, because you get tripped up. It's hard to imagine that that's the story. But what if we're the judge? How are we described? And let's see whether it's accurate. We don't fear God, and we don't respect other people. Not you and me, but the other folks. I mean, you are here. Right? It's interfaith, and it's Sunday morning, and so it can't be any of us. But the other people, they don't fear God, and they don't respect other people. What if that's us? And what if the widow, we don't know anything about her claim, we just know that she really wants to get our attention, persistently. What if that's God? That's so brilliant. It's so good. Because it's completely consonant with the idea that what you think you see isn't what's actually going on. And the story that here we are, we believe that we were the penitent. We were the one who aren't getting justice. And the big machine or the big man in the sky or the world isn't working in our favor. But what if it's just the opposite? Martin Buber has a collection of early Hasidic tales from the great Hasidic masters from the 17th century. And in one of them, he describes a little boy who is with his friends has been playing hide and seek. And he's gone to hide like all his friends, and he hears the other friend counting to the numbers, and he waits hiding, and it becomes clear that too much time has gone by, and no one's coming looking for him. And so he comes out of his hiding place, and he's crying, and he goes to his grandfather, and his grandfather asks what's wrong, and he tells him the story. I was playing hide and seek, and my friends stopped looking for me. And his grandfather says, that's what God says too. That's a pretty good story. That's what God says too. I'm hiding, and no one's looking for me. I'm the widow asking for your attention. Just hear my plea. Hear what I have to suggest to you. And we're busy with our own things, right? I was just reading an article this morning in my feed. You look at the wrong things and you start getting the wrong stuff. It turns out you look at the right things, you start getting the right stuff. And so it's from the Christian Post, and it was describing the demography of Christianity today and the sociology of who's in the pews and who's not. And what it suggested was that it's not theological or morality that's keeping folks away, that we've gotten too busy. We've gotten our soccer leagues and our shopping and our this. And I'm not passing judgment. I know this community very well, right? If you feel like I'm ever pointing a finger at you, there are 4 more pointing back at me. But maybe we're the judge who's unjust or isn't giving a proper hearing. And so I want to thank you for the insight. And I think it just dovetails beautifully with what Amy Jo Levine said at the very beginning. The parables are meant to not confuse us, but confound us a little bit, or to challenge us, to confront and to recognize, I've used that before, ourselves and what's right in front of us. Okay.
If that is one reasonable reading, that we are the judge and God is the widow, who is God to you? Does that change your understanding of the divine at all? Because one of the things I talked about earlier in the sermon is what you're praying to, like the widows asking for justice. What is it you're praying to? Is it the force? Is it the giant vending machine in the sky? Is it the God of the Scriptures? What is this deity to which you are praying? How do you interact with that? And for me, beginning to view God as that widow who seeks us, who gives us a black eye, pummeling us, trying to get our attention, knocking, seeking, asking, is a revealing and refreshing view of God from what I find mostly I have. One of the things Aaron and I have been talking about and we experienced yesterday is it's this twisting and then the first shall be last. Maybe we're the judge and God is the widow. It's flipping things around to arrest you to pay attention to a new thing. Because what has been domesticated, the parables, and it's a very easy transition. If the parables are domesticated when we name them and tame them, we also do a similar thing to God. Because we know what it all means, we understand it all. And we can domesticate our faith, and then what have we got? A very boring, tame faith. When in fact, the Bible tells stories about this God who can't be contained. This God who keeps working for justice and fighting for the people and fighting for the widow and the orphan and the people who are captured as slaves and constantly challenging and delivering us. And that is a very refreshing and vibrant faith to engage in rather than one where we know all the answers. Aaron and I were talking earlier as well about this young person who's like, I've already got an A and I've calculated in my class, and if I calculated, I don't have to do anything else homework-wise the rest of the semester, and I will still get an A. I'm not suggesting that you have ever thought of that as well, but you know what? I can focus on other things. I don't need to do these stupid readings and little boring assignments. I got an A, I'm just done. And I have been asked an untold number of times, just tell me what I'm supposed to believe. What am I supposed to do? Okay, I got to go to Mass. I've got to do confession in a more Catholic sense. I've got to accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. Or I'm supposed to give 10%. Is that on like pre-tax income or what exactly? What's the minimum I have to do? And again, not judging anyone, but what is it in fact in this next story, which we don't really have time to get to, the next story and all throughout the Scriptures, and to be a disciple of Jesus, to follow God the Creator, what does God ask of us over and over? All throughout the Scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, in Jesus, from the prophets, what? Yeah, give me an answer. God demands tikkun olam to make the world a better place, to repair the world. To follow the commandments, is that a reasonable? To follow the commandments. To trust in Him. What else does God ask? Pay attention. Follow Him. Whew, collaborative. Somebody's been to seminary. Collaborative eschatology. Yeah. So bringing a collaborative eschatology usually means the end of the world, or the telos, the end working of time and what it's all for. And so in Judaism, by the way, thank you for giving the answer to the question I was asking from class 1. The kingdom of God is the main point that Jesus talks about. That's the subject over and over and over. And with Judaism, the parallel idea is tikkun olam, the Messianic age, is probably a more precise definition. And so what does the world look like when it is repaired? What does the creation look like with justice and love and mercy when the lion lies down with the lamb, and like these weird, when the first shall be last? It's all different ways of pointing to the same thing. Not what's the minimum we can do to get into heaven, or the minimum requirements I must have, but where is the world restructured, and why do you restructure it? To make it how it's supposed to be. To restore all of creation for the way that God intended it to be. And so the domestication, the taming, is, I would say, fundamentally not what Jesus was trying to do, but to open up with these stories to provoke, to challenge, to pester, to make us pay attention to that, because in fact this faith is alive and amazing and dynamic. And all throughout, from the very beginning, how does God make the world happen, the whole creation happen? Do hand waving and cool stuff? The very essence of God, the breath of God, issues out, and there comes all of the creation. So we are the dust of the earth and the breath of God at the same time. And if you can begin to think like that, wait, that's what the kingdom of God is like. God has breathed life into us, is the most amazing and dynamic thing that I want to be a part of. And I want to learn more and go deeper. And so what Jesus asked, and I think, quite honestly, God asked the same thing, is I don't want disciples just a little bit. The next story is sell everything and follow me. Not because wealth itself is the point. It's because wealth, in the next story, that's the thing, the young ruler, or the ruler, had followed all the commandments. It lists several of the 10 commandments. He did all the right things, presumably for the right reasons. And he did everything the right way. Let's just assume his heart was right, too. Because in many of these stories, he's a bad guy. But in this particular story that follows, He did it for the right reasons. And what did that guy lack? Sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow me. Because that's what God really wants, not your money. He wants, he, she, it, the Lord wants what?
Your time and talents, yourself.
More than your time and your talent. Everything. That's the point. Does he want some of the chosen people? All of them, all of the covenant people. Does he want some of you, or does God love some people? Everybody, all of it, or everyone is part of the plan, and all of you. Does that mean you can't do certain things? Who cares? That's not what we're talking about. It is every bit of you that God desires to be in relationship with. And that starts to open up your whole life to all these possibilities. When you look at the stories, you see God, you imagine your relationship, your life of faith, as fundamentally an experience of liberation rather than another series of things you've got to do. That, I think, is what the story is fundamentally about.
The parable following, right?
Yeah, I started talking about
it's
it.
good.
We got 3 minutes.
All right, so let me give you this insight. Take a look at the back of the page about the parable. A certain ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." We now call that idea, it was introduced by Moses Maimonides in the 12th century, who did for Judaism what St. Thomas Aquinas did for Christianity, which is to merge religious philosophy and thought with Greek logic, so that we could do if-thens and locate things and make sense in a schematic way of our faith traditions. He then says, "No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments." Now he's referring to, there's 613 commandments, but usually when we refer to the commandments, we're speaking of the 10 commandments. So count how many he lists here, and then let's see who can name which ones are not included in the list.
I'll take a break here.
I'll speed this along. The ones that are not included, and you should just appreciate that the Jewish and the Christian enumeration of the 10 Commandments differs slightly. It's a different lecture. We may do that in back to the sources. But here's what's missing, depending on whether you read the Jewish or the Christian enumeration of them. "I am the Lord your God. No other gods before me. No graven images. Don't use my name in vain. And honor or keep," depending upon whether you use the Exodus or Deuteronomy's version of the 10 Commandments, "honor or keep the Sabbath day." Anything that's theological or particularistic isn't included in the commandments that this person is enumerating as the ones that is expected of you. So which ones are expected of you? Not to commit adultery, honor your relationships, not to murder, not to steal, not to bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Those are the universal ones. Those are the ones about how we treat each other. I don't have much more time than this, but that's what I want to leave you with regard to what we might pull out of this particular parable in terms of what is required of you, what is the expectation of you. Not that you needn't believe or shouldn't believe, although you might be interested to know that in the entire enumeration of the 613 mitzvot or commandments, as the rabbis in the Talmudic period, which is contemporaneous with Jesus and the gospel writers, that the 613 commandments that they enumerate never mandate belief in God. It never says you shall believe. You shall love the Lord your God. You can demonstrate your love for God by behaving in these ways in keeping with various principles that are theological, but mandating belief is not one of the foundational commandments of Judaism, and it doesn't seem to be what is going on in this parable necessarily either. What you believe is interesting, but what your beliefs compel you to do or what you do with your life is significant. Let me leave you with this. We choose how to read the parables, and in doing so we harness the parables' ambiguities and the ambiguity of the lives they depict, and indeed the ambiguity of our own lives. Parables are intended to disturb. At the very least, this one should call into question our stereotypes of widows and judges. And once our stereotypes are shattered, we can begin to see people as individuals rather than the roles in society they occupy. Stories, whether ancient or modern, hold our interest because people do what they are not expected to do. Women hide yeast in dough. Samaritans show compassion. Tax collectors recognize their sinful state. And we are open to the wild possibilities of our lives. Thank you.
Thanks.